So hey everyone, my name is Mohammed, and today I'm going to be talking about a story that's actually quite similar to my own. But up until recently, until I started researching this presentation, I didn't really think of it in that way. And this is the story of Britain's first Arabs, or Britain's first Yemenis. They were Yemeni immigrants who settled along the coastal towns of Britain and built good lives for themselves and their families, and had to learn how to integrate with a new culture while still trying to hold on to their own. And although I think I've never recently really thought of myself in that way until recently, but actually I'm an immigrant to the UK myself, to Britain. I come from South Africa, born to an Iraqi father and a South African mother. And I came here to the UK to study, but then decided to settle and actually stay on. So I myself am an immigrant. And so despite the different times and despite perhaps the different circumstances that we both arrived here, I felt a very close connection to this story in particular. And the way Britain's first Yemenis dealt with issues such as identity and the feeling of belonging and integrating while still holding true to their cultural background. So I thought for my forward, I would share this story with all of you guys. So this story comes from a documentary I watched a while back from Aljazeera World called or titled Britain's First Yemenis. And it interviews both living Yemenis who came over to the UK, about 70 years ago, as well as their descendants and the Yemenis who are living in the UK today who descend from these original Yemenis. And it's quite an interesting story where it tells the struggles of the original immigrants, but then also the struggles of of their descendants and the people living in the UK today, trying to hold on to their past, to hold on to their culture while feeling integrated inside the UK. So I thought it was quite an interesting documentary. But it's also an extension of a book called Britain's First Muslims, first written in the 1990s by the author Fred Halliday. And he's quite an interesting author. He is a polyglot. He speaks 12 languages, I think, Arabic being one of them. But the Arab world is of particular interest to Fred Halliday. He has a number of books about the Middle East and the Arab world. And this was, I think, Yemen was the topic of his PhD thesis. And so this is a book that he wrote. Unfortunately, he passed away, I think, just recently. But he's quite a good author, and I'd highly recommend you check out his books as well. So diving into the story of Britain's first Arabs. So the Yemenis came over to the UK, or their first interaction with the UK, as as many other people around the world, was through colonialism. So the UK and Britain had a colony in the port of Aden and majority of the south of Yemen, and Yemenis were working on the navy vessels. This was during the time of World War I. Many British personnel didn't really want to work in the coal chambers of these naval ships. They were coal powered naval ships at the time, and the Yemenis had a bit more ironcladed fists, I guess, and they basically were working in these ships. And then as the British sailors went out to war for World War I, the Yemenis kind of took their place and stayed in these naval ships. And as the ships docked in the coastal towns of Cardiff and some other Welsh towns, the Yemenis stayed, and they kind of became Britain's first immigrants. But of course, it wasn't always smooth sailing. They weren't immediately accepted within the community. They were seen as colonial subjects. They were seen as not being able to live side by side the real British population. And so what the Yemenis were forced to do is actually set up their own what they called boarding houses. And they set up Arab boarding houses, and these Arab boarding houses actually became the center and the heart of the Yemeni community in the UK. And that's where they started cultivating their own sense of identity as British Yemenis, and this kind of new identity as a community in the UK. This is also, during World War I and even II, many British Yemenis actually fought alongside the British soldiers, and they lost a good number of their own community. And so those questions, around belonging and patriotism, at least to the Yemenis, they thought they were answered, given that they fought, side by side. But what actually happened when World War I was over and all these British sailors and army, when they came back to the UK, they kind of wanted to get back into their old jobs. And what they found was that there were many Yemenis had already taken these jobs that they wanted to work in, whether that was the coal mines or the industrial factories. And so this bit of resentment started to rise at the time. And there was a resentment against Arabs and Yemenis in particular around the towns they used to live at. And sort of tensions started rising. And there's one story of an Arab industrial worker who was part of a union, and he kind of stepped forth to kind of work back on one of his naval ships. And the head of that union kind of stopped him and said, why is an Arab getting this job ahead of a native British person or a white British person? And they kind of fell out into a brawl, and that brawl kind of expanded towards the whole city. And there was a lot of tension and commotion at the time against the local community. And unfortunately, what happened then was that the UK government rounded up around 600 Yemenis and actually expatriated them back to the Yemen. And despite these people having, settled in the UK, many of them married local women, local wives, and had children of mixed race and heritage, they were still shipped off back to Yemen. But despite all of this, the Yemeni community still stood strong. They still, kept themselves together as a community and actually survived, and really thrived within those cities of Cardiff. And it was quite interesting because after all the struggles and after finding work after the war, after trying to prove themselves worthy of being a patriotic British citizen, the next step was then to try to find wives and spouses and partners to kind of settle in the UK. Most of the Yemenis who came over were male, though the people who worked in the ships, and many of them married locally and local women, which is not so commonplace at the time. This is talking about the 1920s and 1930s, but also Arabs weren't really known as a race at the time in Britain. And there's a scene in the documentary where they show one of these older Yemeni men who had married a local Welsh woman. And she was explaining how, at the time when she approached her father to say, I want to marry this man, but I didn't know how to describe him because we didn't know what an Arab was. And so she said, well, he's not Italian and he's not black. He's somewhere in between. And, with that, the father said, gave his consent and they were able to get married. So I thought that was just a bit of a funny scene in the film. But they very much integrated, they very much settled. And today they're one of the strongest, most thriving communities in the UK. There's around 70,000 to 80,000 Yemenis or British people of Yemeni descent in the UK today. And even though it's one of the smaller communities, it's one which is quite well established and have a long history here in the UK, and they've contributed a lot to British culture. Actually, one member of the Little Mix, I believe, is of Yemeni descent, one of these British Yemenis. I can't remember which one, but one of them is. So very much integrated into British society and, an integral part of Britain's recent history. So that kind of brings us to the end of the presentation of, how Britain's first Arabs came to Britain and settled into Britain, and, still kind of that whole process still continuing today in terms of the British society, Yemeni community living here in the UK. So in terms of reading more, understanding more about the British Yemeni community, besides the book that I mentioned at the beginning of Fred Halliday, there's actually a really good community project and organization who just shows how connected and organized the Yemeni community is in the UK, called the Yemeni Project. And they kind of document stories of, Britain's first Yemenis who came here to the UK, but also kind of preserving that cultural heritage of the contribution they made to the country. And of course, expanding that to the current generation of Yemenis here in the UK, as well as everybody else who's interested in them. So I highly recommend checking them out. They do some events if you ever are in the UK, but also just reading their articles and stories is very, very interesting. So thank you guys so much for listening to today's presentation. You can obviously find me online. So looking forward to the next one. Thank you.